Good evening. I'm Albert Carnesell, the Dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government and the Provost of Harvard University, and it's my privilege to welcome you here this evening. One measure of the perceived importance of a speaker in this forum is the number of school organizations that come to sponsor his or her appearance. Let me read the list. This evening's event is co-sponsored by the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, the Program in Criminal Justice Policy and Management, the Institute of Politics, the Radcliffe Public Policy Institute, the Kennedy School Women's Caucus, and the Kennedy School Health, Education, Labor, and Poverty Professional Interest Council. Now, a former colleague of ours, Professor Mary Jo Bain, who was the first director of the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, took leave from the Kennedy School faculty to serve as Assistant Secretary for Health and Human Services for Children and Families. And Mary Jo used to characterize the objectives of her teaching and the objectives of the center as training people to have, quote, soft hearts and hard heads, people who could apply tough analysis to terribly difficult, very human problems, close quote. Now, on anyone's list of the most difficult and important problems facing our nation, the issues of health care, welfare, and the physical and emotional well-being of America's children and their families rank at or certainly near the very top. Our guest this evening faces these terribly difficult, very human problems every day. As Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, she is responsible for more than 250 programs in health, welfare, food, drug safety, and income assistance. And she has to operate in a political climate that, to put it mildly, has yet to reach consensus on solutions. Donna Shalala entered public life in 1975 as treasurer of the Municipal Assistance Corporation, which brought New York City back from the brink of bankruptcy. She was an Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the Carter administration, and in 1980 became president of Hunter College in New York. In 1988, she became chancellor of the University of Wisconsin, the nation's fourth largest institution of higher education. There, she successfully recruited many women and minorities to the faculty. She reached out to students, she aggressively raised funds, and she oversaw the transformation of the Wisconsin football team from the doormat of the Big Ten into a Rose Bowl champion. But of course, the epitome of her academic career came when she served as a member of the Kennedy School Visiting Committee, but I won't spend any more time on that. In 1992, President Clinton appointed her as Secretary of Health and Human Services. At Health and Human Services, she has earned praise for her leadership and for her substantive command of the broad range of issues facing this department. Tonight, she'll be addressing domestic violence and the challenges to making America safer. A graduate of the Western College for Women and a holder of master's and PhD degrees from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, Donna Shalala is someone who believes she can change things, and often does. Please join me in welcoming the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Honorable Donna Shalala.
Thank you very much, Al. Thank you for that very nice introduction. Am I on Bob Reich's stool? Is this? It's just not. Actually, I was a foot taller before I went to Washington. I want to thank all of the various institutions that are sponsoring my visit here. I deeply appreciate that. I have many old friends in this audience, and I won't be able to introduce any of them because I want to get on with the text and give you an opportunity to ask me questions. Let me thank the Kennedy School for loaning me many of the fine scholars who study health and social policy, in particular, of course, David Ellwood and Mary Jo Bain, the two assistant secretaries that are the architects of the President's welfare reform plan, and a former faculty member, Walter Broadnext, who was here for some years. They have brought, I hope, along with the other assistant secretaries, a particular brand of policy leadership. I have been accused of recruiting mainly from universities, and it's true. For the students that are here, Washington at this point in time needed a special kind of senior political appointment, and I tried to recruit from the nation's best universities people who had both experience in government as well as academic experience, because we were very much going to be on the cutting edge in a whole set of issues. So across the department are people like Mary Jo Bain, who have both run large government programs and worried about how we think about the issues and how we do research on them, and worried, more importantly for those of us who have spent our careers in the academic world, about what the next generation of policy analysts and policy leaders would look like and how they're trained. I will eventually send all of these people back in about 6 years. But I came tonight to talk about domestic violence, something that I call actually domestic terrorism, though I'll be happy to talk a little more broadly about the issues facing the department and the administration in the question and answer period. I want to begin by telling you about Nora Cash. This is a woman who endured years of brutal beatings. When her ex-partner lost control, he grabbed her hair and threw her against a wall. He'd punch her in the face and blacken her eyes, and once he actually fractured her skull. She and her children suffered 7 long years of constant torment and physical terror. She was, in no uncertain terms, by anyone's definition, a battered woman. But there's a better part to Nora's story. The beatings finally stopped, and that's because the last time her ex-boyfriend attacked her, it happened in Quincy, right down the expressway from here. In a sense, she finally got lucky, because Quincy has one of the most progressive and comprehensive programs in America to stop domestic violence. In a perfect world, justice would not be dependent on geography, but this is an imperfect world. In many parts of this country, women don't feel safe in their own homes. They're threatened, they're punched, they're kicked, and even when they get away, they're often stalked like animals, and even worse things happen to them. What I want to talk about today is the challenges before us, the challenge to make American homes safer, the challenge to continue the forward momentum in treating domestic violence as a serious social issue, as a serious public health issue, and the challenge of building on the good work of places like Quincy so that every woman gets the help they deserve and the services they need. Right now in this country, we're actually at a crossroads. Never before has there been so much public attention on the issues of abuse of women and their families. Never before have we begun to target significant resources to this problem. And never before have we had the momentum on a national scale to develop a systemic and comprehensive solution. Last year, the president fought like mad for a comprehensive crime bill that included a historic $1.6 billion Violence Against Women Act. Later this year, we plan to implement the first phase of the act, which will be a national hotline that will operate 24 hours a day, every day of the year. 2 weeks ago, we actually had a scare, and my friends who were in Congress last year will understand this, because Karen Shepard and Jill Long, who are fellows here this year, understand that sometimes the House Appropriations Committee, particularly the subcommittee, gets out of control, and it did a couple weeks ago. It made a reckless rescission in the crime bill and actually cut that hotline out. It lasted about 24 hours because the Republican majority, when they stripped the hotline of funding, forgot that there was bipartisan support for the funding, and women's groups across the country, Republican women's groups, were outraged, and so was the president. But we prevailed, and they quickly put the money back in. However, resources were cut from the community schools program, from the ounce of prevention program, and some of these will be restored as we get to full committees and get to the Senate side, particularly programs that were put in place to give young people opportunity and support that will, in the end, prevent crime and violence. But for the moment, the hotline money and the violence against women money actually appears intact. This particular service will be monumental as a step forward for victims of domestic violence. It will help save lives, but more importantly, it will prevent misery. Once it goes online, a nonprofit organization which will run it will provide information about services to every community in America. There will be a single hotline that anyone can call from any place in America, and they'll direct the individual to services. But it's also going to be a great challenge for us, and that's what puts us at a crossroads at this point of time. Because that switchboard, when it starts lighting up, we have to be ready across this country with shelters, with safe houses, with services, with counselors. We'll need well-trained police officers, we'll need health professionals, we'll need social workers, we'll need prosecutors, and we'll need judges. If we're going to help women emerge from violent relationships and go on with their lives, the services are going to have to be in place, so the referrals fit to the services. That's the kind of system that was available to Nora Cash when she needed help. And I think it's instructive to look at how Quincy responded to Nora and to really learn from it. First, the police arrived and they acted promptly. The officers investigated thoroughly, and they did something Nora had not experienced in other jurisdictions. They didn't just tell her that she needed help, they showed her where she could get help. The officers also encouraged her to go to the courthouse to file for an order of protection, and assured her, and this was absolutely critical, that she would be protected if she went before a judge. That she would be protected if she went before a judge. Every time she had to appear to testify against her abuser, a social worker helped her fill out the paperwork and briefed her about her options. And every time she walked into the courthouse in Quincy, the same police officer was at her side, Sergeant Thomas Tierney. Just as he promised her he would be the day he intervened on her behalf. And you begin to see the seamless system that Quincy had put into place. Her ex-partner went on to serve time, and he's now out of her life. The system did what it is supposed to do. She is no longer a battered woman. In fact, she's happily married, and I invited her to be with us today, but she just went into labor, and the baby can't wait. Quincy's record on domestic violence is distinctive because for a long time, it has stood against a backdrop of national failure. Here's how they got started. In 1987, a district court judge named Albert Kramer sat down with District Attorney Woman Delahunt, and I think District Attorney Delahunt is here. There he is. Delahunt's office had provided advocacy service for battered women for more than a decade, and their goal was to use the resources of the court to protect women and to punish those who hurt them. The effort took more than the police, the prosecutors, and the judges. It required bringing in mental health officials, it required bringing in advocates and the social service community. And together they designed a new approach to handling cases of domestic abuse. Police officers have been retrained to do a thorough investigation at the scene of all domestic violence calls. District attorney advocates conduct daily briefings for battered women. Quincy now publishes the availability of mental health and advocacy services for women, and they recruit interns and law students to support women in the difficult task of testifying against their former husbands or their former boyfriends. The authorities force any abuser named in the civil protection order to turn over all guns in his possession. And the courts have established policies to move ahead on the prosecution of cases, even when the intimidated victims cannot participate in the trial process. Ultimately, women have been safer in Quincy. We know this for the fact. From the late 1980s until now, deaths from homicides and domestic abuse relationships have almost completely vanished in Quincy. And in 1992, the Kennedy School and the Ford Foundation gave Quincy a prestigious Innovations in State and Local Government Award. I know there are some of the other awardees who will be making presentations in the next couple of days. And it's these kinds of programs, but Quincy's in particular, that are the model programs for the country. But what is a shame is that across the country, very few cities and towns can protect people as well as Quincy does. There are other successful efforts. In San Diego, for example, in Duluth, Minnesota, in my own hometown of Madison, Wisconsin, in Newport News, Virginia, and some state assemblies have enacted legislation which denies custody right to abusers. Florida and Delaware passed that kind of legislation the past year. And some major cities, New York and Chicago among them, are beginning to train officers to specifically track down and follow up on cases of intimate violence. But we still have a long way to go. For years, crime surveys have demonstrated that women are more likely to be injured or raped by someone they know rather than by a stranger. And yet, too often, law enforcement officials treat domestic violence less seriously than acts of random violence. All too often, jurisdictions require women to initiate formal complaints before the police make an arrest. And too often, a police refers a victim to a social service agency. But the woman is too frightened to show up. And today I met with a group of battered women at one of the local hospitals. And they talked about how terrorizing the experience has been and how frightened they were to show up, and what a difference advocates and police officers that were trained and other law enforcement people made. And often no one follows up with them. And then there are, of course, the instances of judicial insensitivity. Last year in Maryland, a Maryland judge sentenced a man just to 18 months in prison for the shotgun killing of his wife. He allegedly found his wife in bed with another man. And let me read you what the judge said, because it was really outrageous. The judge said, "I seriously wonder how many men would have had the strength to walk away without inflicting some corporate punishment. I'm forced to impose a sentence only because I think I must do it to make the system honest." That comment is unbelievable and unacceptable. From a citizen or from a public official, it's outrageous. It doesn't matter what the circumstances were. Killing your partner must be treated exactly the same as killing a stranger in this country. And until this happens, families in America will continue to suffer. What we need, and what the Quincy example tells you, is we need a seamless system, a system that's protective of endangered women and their children, a system that follows their progress from incident to safety, no matter where they live or work in this country, a system that leaves no gaps. A seamless system is both capable of identifying families in trouble and delivering the services they need. A seamless system includes well-trained, well-educated police officers who understand the pervasive nature of domestic violence, officers who understand the reluctance of women to leave their homes and their neighborhoods, officers who understand how terrorized battered women are, what low self-esteem they have, and how difficult it is to pick up and leave, and who understand that it's almost impossible for these women to even think of reporting on their abusers. This is because they've lived for years paralyzed by fear and denial, frightened for their children. A seamless system includes health professionals trained to notify authorities when they suspect abuse, as is done today in suspected child abuse. We need to put in place a system even better than our current child abuse system. Once abuse is confirmed, a seamless system has professionals accessible to treat mental and physical consequences of abuse in women. And frankly, often the mental issues are as serious as the physical issues. We can fix some of the physical issues, but the human element, the psychological element, is often as serious, if not more serious. And a seamless system includes courts that efficiently and effectively move cases of intimate violence to trial. A seamless system involves schools in educating children that family violence is wrong and that they can get help by telling someone about their problems at home. And a seamless system includes a series of shelters familiar to every professional in the community. A seamless system includes services to hold batterers accountable, and in some cases, that may involve counseling in the rest, jail, or prison. A seamless system assures that all the different professionals are talking to one another. And if you talk to women who have been through the experience, the lack of coordination of services is absolutely key. Coordinating their services is critical, and cutting through the bureaucracy, of course. And a seamless system draws in the private sector to create more partnerships, like the work undertaken last year in a public awareness campaign, which was sponsored by the Family Violence Prevention Fund of San Francisco and the Advertising Council, called "There's No Excuse for Domestic Violence." That program had support from Liz Claiborne, from Marshalls, among other companies. That's the seamless system we envision. And too often what we get now is a busy signal in a social worker's office, police officers who don't acknowledge domestic violence when they see it, and emergency room doctors that are so overworked that they don't have time to ask a woman with a broken jaw whether she was hit by someone, particularly by someone in her own family. And courts that treat domestic violence as if it were a private matter. It is not a private matter. That's why we continue to hear stories like Kristen Lardner's. 3 years ago, she was killed by her ex-boyfriend in broad daylight on Commonwealth Avenue. That wouldn't have happened, except there were cracks in the current system. More than once, the police picked up her killer and put him back on the street in days. More than once, court officials and mental health officials dropped the ball as well. A tragic story, and a tragic reminder that when we have holes in our system, people fall through those holes and they die. As part of the seamless system that we envision, we have to have health professionals talking to their counterparts at law enforcement, and we have to move beyond the kind of reactive approach to domestic violence and start focusing on prevention. Investing up front in prevention is the major commitment of the Clinton administration. Last year, with new funding, the Centers for Disease Control began an extensive review of community-based prevention programs. We sent out grants to institutions like Johns Hopkins, which is evaluating emergency room responses to battered women, and to Rutgers, which is evaluating the effectiveness of legal interventions, including arrest, for reducing risks to abuse victims. But this new grant money can only get us started on the prevention research that we really need. We received more than 80 eligible grant applications, and we funded only 8. And that's why the President fought hard to make certain that the Violence Against Women Act, which included an enormous amount of prevention money, that we passed it intact. The activists and the researchers who advised Congress on the act made a convincing argument that we had to invest in research and in community prevention. There has never been a definitive study on the validity of the battered women syndrome as a psychological condition. By year's end, thanks to the Violence Against Women Act, the National Institute of Justice and the National Institutes of Health will have such a report for us. We've made other investments in research and in the crime bill so that we could find answers to truly some complicated questions. We need to know why witnessing violence increases the likelihood of becoming a victim or an abuser. We need to know more about the link between violence against women and the abuse of children. And we need to know how to train massive numbers of professionals to recognize domestic violence. Later this week, my department will award a $1 million grant to study how we can help primary grant givers primary caregivers identify and treat victims of domestic violence. That kind of research and training will provide answers and solutions for tomorrow, but we also have to provide immediate answers for the women who have no options today. And that's why the Act nearly doubles the current amount of money available for emergency shelter assistance. By the year 2000, we expect to triple the amount of money in this country spent on emergency shelters. These resources are critical for the women who have no place where they feel safe. And with prevention funds being cut so indiscriminately from the crime bill, the President is keeping his eye on every provision of the Violence Against Women Act. We don't intend to slash these programs for a tax cut or for the construction of more prisons. I think that we can all agree that the Violence Against Women Act is actually historic. But there's one thing I've learned in 2 years at HHS, it's that government can't solve great social problems alone, and it shouldn't be counted on to try. Any strategy to stop domestic violence in this country has to have a broad network of citizens, including every single one of us in this room. And so I came really today to applaud the extraordinary efforts in this state and around the country. The AMA and the ABA have stepped up to the plate. The American Medical Association is encouraging doctors to join a coalition of physicians against family violence. The doctors are also have available to them a series of diagnostic treatment guidelines for abuse against women and child abuse and elder abuse for the first time. And last year, a task force in the American Bar Association released a stunning report. They chastised lawyers and judges and doctors and others, mostly in the legal community, for providing inadequate legal services for battered women and for their children. In response, they've stepped up too, and under the crime bill, the legal community is working to educate and train a wide variety of law enforcement officials, including attorneys and prosecutors and judges. We're also seeing that child welfare workers and battered women advocates who have almost always worked separately in this country are beginning to join forces. In about half the homes where women are being abused, there is also evidence of child abuse. And it's high time we took a closer look at how we can help all the victims of family violence feel safe in this country. The more we learn, the more we know that keeping women safe keeps children safe too. This morning, I visited a program at Children's Hospital here in Boston called Awake, which serves battered women by reaching out to them when they bring in their children for health care. These are all big steps forward, but there's another even more important group that we have to mobilize. That's the citizens in our neighborhoods, in our communities, the people who in their daily lives set the standard for what behavior is acceptable and what behavior is not. We need millions of Americans to turn off their televisions and to turn their interest from one man's sensational murder trial to the trials of every family at risk in this country. Families that live right down the block, a family that may live next door, a friend, a cousin, a neighbor. We have to make sure that domestic violence doesn't go back into the closet the way it was in the past. We have to mobilize police chiefs and doctors and attorneys and judges and public officials in every community in this country, just as your neighbors in Quincy mobilized and organized to stop violence in the homes in that community. We have to encourage parents to talk to their children about violence and teach them that hitting and punching are not the way to solve problems. And in every Head Start center in this country, Mary Jo Bain has assured me that we have a violence a program in place that teaches children that hitting other kids is not the way to solve their problems. We're also working very closely with their parents with our violence initiative in Head Start. We have to inspire more people to volunteer in shelters and hotlines and to become more sensitive, more honest in dealing with friends who may be victims. Above all, we have to do everything in our power to make sure that the next generation of children feels safe and comfortable in their own homes. Which brings me to a story that I'd like to conclude with today. It's a story you'll never forget. It's about a tiny little girl who entered a program for the children of battered women. The girls and boys in this group were encouraged to talk about and to draw out their fears and their frustrations. They also learned that when mommy is in trouble, when she's being hurt by daddy, it is possible to get help by dialing 911. A couple of years later, a very shy, tiny 8-year-old walked in on a fight. Her father, would you believe, was a child psychiatrist. He was beating her mother on the head with a hammer. If you can imagine that situation for that 8-year-old, imagine what you would do if you were 8 years old. You would be paralyzed by fear. But that little girl knew what to do. She remembered a lesson taught to her by a caring adult. She picked up the telephone and she pressed 911, and she saved her mother's life. The father went to prison, and the family's trying their best to build a new life. If that little girl can have the courage to pick up the telephone, surely all of us can have the courage to prevent some stories from ever happening. If that child can have the courage to pick up the telephone, surely we, the caring adults of this generation, the leaders of this country, ought to meet the challenge of domestic terrorism. Thank you very much.
So we're fortunate here, and that Secretary Shalala will answer some questions. We have 2 microphones here, so if you'd use the microphone, identify yourself, and we can start with the first question.
Thank you. My name is Avery Gardner. I'm a sophomore at the college and a member of the Institute's Student Advisory Committee. And one of the things that I see as being a major problem in the issue of domestic violence is that so many women are concerned about the welfare of their children, who may also be caught in the middle of the situation. Worried that if they do go to a shelter, their children will no longer be cared for. Their children will not have the food that they need, will not have the shelter over their heads, the clothing that they need, because they'll be leaving their economic source of support. How do we deal with that sort of system? Is that part of our welfare package? How do we deal with that beyond the existence of temporary shelters?
The answer is that the temporary shelter is a temporary shelter and has to be there to help that woman both find a job if necessary, to get on assistance if necessary, but to be able to set up her own household and keep her children with her, and be able to move out into a safe place. And across this country, the shelters, carefully coordinated with other kinds of services in the community, making sure there's a fit is part of that seamless system that I talked about. And for any of us that have spent, and I've spent hours in shelters, it's that role that the advocates in the shelter play, both to help the woman move through the judicial system, but more importantly, to help her get the self-confidence to move out and set up an independent life. What keeps her often in the situation with the abuser is a lack of economic security. I must say, as the governor of this state starts proposing waivers in which people have to find jobs within 60 days, my assumption is there are going to be some exceptions there that help us to be able to work with women in these situations and with their families.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Art Christopherson. I'm a member of the Student Advisory Committee at the Institute. You've spoken a lot about the violence amongst the older members of society between men and women. When I was a junior in high school, a sophomore who was 15 years old, she was beaten to death with a baseball bat by a 17-year-old boy whom I knew was in my class. And that, pretty much shattered the community. We had it was quite an ordeal. My question is, what sort of programs or initiatives are being taken to directly target teenage violence and the relationships that teenagers are having?
You're right. We have most recently become very aware in this country of teenage relationships and the presence of younger batterers in those relationships, and the dependency that also has to be broken within those relationships. And part of the Violence Against Women Act actually targets people much younger. So it works in schools with young people so that they understand too and have places they can go for help. And it requires quite a different approach for young women and working with young men.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Estelle Weil. I'm a student at the Harvard School of Public Health and also volunteer here in the Boston area for battered women. And one of the major problems is when women leave their home and come to a shelter, they're then homeless. And there's not enough housing. And there's a waiting list of 5 to 10 years for assisted housing. What can be done so that these women, if they knew that they wouldn't be homeless, they might be more apt to leave?
That again has to be part of the fitting together of services, because the priority list for housing is different than the priority list that the community might put together if it determined who ought to be able to jump the line, for example, for certain kinds of housing. And again, it's the financial package, the transitional package that needs to be put together. And it is a complicated process to put that together, and we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is. And that's why the role of advocates and interveners and someone who is basically the case manager for that individual that sticks with her to both assess her skills as well as what needs to be put together for her in a safe place with a support system is so important. And what we can't do is think about just the housing piece or just the job piece, but putting all the different pieces together.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Steve Marks, and I'm a student at the Harvard School of Public Health. I also have worked for the last 6 years doing batters groups. Could you address the possibility of a bipartisan effort to raise the minimum wage, particularly as a prevention effort, so that there's a living wage for women who want to leave their batterers, and also comparable worth?
You know, the president, as you know, has supported a raise in the minimum wage, but it's more than the women. It's more for women who are setting up a household. The fact is that you give a man a job at the minimum wage and he may be able to support himself. A woman has to support a family on the minimum wage. So it's all the pieces. My great concern about the debate that's going on in Washington is that we're so busy trying to reduce the size of the nation's commitment in terms of social policy that we're going to cut out what are essentially the economic supports, not just for battered women, but for a whole generation of people that we're trying to move from welfare to work, as well as those that do work but are marginal and have to bring up their families in poverty. A very high percentage of people actually on the minimum wage are trying to support a family. I would say to you that it's not just the minimum wage. It's what we've done on the Earned Income Tax Credit, which tries to raise a family above the poverty line using the tax system. It's child care, which is absolutely critical, and to do welfare reform without child care is just impossible. In the middle of the debate last week, I was telling someone that I got so angry because we had moved from orphanages to cutting out child care that I accused the Republicans of moving from Boys Town to Home Alone. It is putting all the pieces in place. If we actually want people to live independently, then we have to make it possible for them to have the resources and the economic incentives to be able to support their families decently. And my particular concern about welfare reform is that the exact family that's willing to play by the rules, that wants to work, is the exact family that's in trouble under all these welfare bills. Because what we're destroying is the supports for low-income working families. What we're doing is targeting the resources, less resources, to the poorest of the poor who can't work, but in the process, we've forgotten about low-income working families. And it seems to me if we want to move large numbers of people from welfare to work, it's the supports for low-income working families. Child care, health care, the Earned Income Tax Credit, the minimum wage as a package, housing subsidies where they're available, and they will be less and less available in the future. As a package, it means that we've sent a very clear message that that work is so important to us that we're prepared to put as many subsidies into low-income families as we do into high-income families.
Hi, my name is Jim Carpenter. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School working on a master's in public administration. 9 years ago, when I graduated from the University of Texas with a master's in social work, I found that social workers were the lowest paid of all the master's level professions. Now they are still the lowest paid, just below teachers. My question is, what can the Clinton administration do, and what can we as a society do to reorient our priorities to pay an adequate salary to the people that are going to work in the kinds of programs that you're talking about tonight?
I'm happy to worry about your problem, but at the moment I'm worried about millions of Americans who may be cut off. Let me talk a little about the role of social work, though, and I've had long association with the profession and the kind of welfare reform the president envisions. When you listen to David Ellwood, and I know many of you took his courses when he was here, and he talks about who the highest paid and the most important person is in a welfare office in the United States. It's actually the clerk that determines people eligibility. It's the person, as one welfare recipient described to the president, they never raised their head when I went in to apply for welfare. And it's the eligibility clerk that makes sure that all the records are complete, because what they're trying to do is to figure out what programs people are eligible for. The way in which we'd like to change the welfare system is actually to take a professional and to change the culture of the office. So what we do is get someone from the moment they walk in ready to get into the workforce, and that the culture of the office is job readiness. In fact, the former Congresswoman from Utah and I visited a place in Salt Lake which was doing exactly that, and what they were doing was it was a worker support program, and it was lots of welfare mothers who complained bitterly to us how tough it was, but it was actually an entire professional staff focused on analyzing what the skill level was of the individual, getting them into jobs, and making sure that they had the support system so they could stay in the jobs. Because most welfare recipients will move off of welfare fairly quickly. Large numbers do in 2 years, almost everybody in 5 years, but they rotate back into the system. The importance of the minimum wage, of the earned income tax credit, of making sure health care is in place for every American, is a whole different way of looking at the social safety net and the current welfare system. What we want to do is support people in jobs, because we think that jobs are so defining in terms of people's self-esteem, how they get mainstreamed into American society. That requires a different level of professional, someone more trained to help people move into the employment market, who gets a chance to practice their profession as opposed to the eligibility on the program. So will we pay people better? Probably, because we'll use a different mix of personnel in the system if we get the kind of genuine welfare reform that we'd like to get. But it's fundamentally a different way of looking at the role of government and supporting people in the workforce.
Hi, my name is Anurima Bhargav. I'm a junior at the college and a member of the Student Advisory Committee here. My question, you talked a lot about...
You have powerful advisors.
That's the secret of our success. You talked a lot about the different pieces that go into a model, a domestic violence model, and specifically about the Quincy model of targeting judges and prosecutors. I work in a program, Court Watch program, that places volunteers in the court to kind of evaluate judges' performance, and those recommendations go back to the judges. Over the past year and a half, it's become increasingly frustrating in the fact that it feels like you can make evaluations of judges and you can educate judges, but at one point you get to, there's a lack of political pressure, there's a lack of some kind of, some way to get judges to finally make that change. And I'm wondering if you have any idea of how to precipitate that change from the other angle, from maybe the political side, because it's really difficult from the evaluation side to try to do that.
I think that I think leaders in the public health profession and leaders in the criminal justice system would say is that it's got to be a team, that when judges' peers talk to them, it makes a difference. And one of the reasons that we want to move away from our kind of stovepipe approach to social policy is that it's really the judges themselves that are going to change the world of judgedom. I mean, it's really judges and law schools and the profession itself, and the importance of the American Bar Associations stepping forward on this issue cannot be underestimated. It's the community culture, too, and community pressure. But acceptable behavior in the judiciary is very much shaped by the leadership of the judiciary itself and by the importance it puts on these kinds of issues. But I can't emphasize enough that we've got to move away from stovepipe programs. And in saying that, I'm not underestimating the problem with block grants or some of the other things that are being talked about in Washington, but the need to see something as a seamless effort so that every part of the system works together. And that's the only way you protect people that are at risk. And that really is the design for the future. The fact that it's been done in smaller communities, in larger communities, in medium-sized communities, the fact that community leaders have come together and put these in place means that we know that they will work, but we also know that you have to keep on top of them and keep retraining people all the time as they're coming into the system.
My name is Stacy Cabot, and I run a human rights agency in Boston called Peace at Home that works to stop domestic violence. I want to first of all thank you. Your work is historic in itself right now. You are probably one of the most outspoken advocates we've had in public life, denouncing domestic violence for what it is, terrorism in the home. So for that, I'm very grateful. I also want to, I also want to ask you how it is that we can be of better support as a community in protecting the Violence Against Women Act as a package. Our governor, Governor Weld, declared a public emergency in the spring of '92 on domestic violence, proving that this is not a partisan issue.
Yeah.
How can we all be involved in helping protect that as a package?
I think that everybody you have to do what you've been doing. The nice thing about this part of the crime bill is that every Republican and Democrat that stood up during the debate on the crime bill was particularly protective of this part. So the issue really has moved into the mainstream in terms of popular support. It's very important that we keep it bipartisan, and that's why I was just mortified when the Appropriations Committee took it out, and I have accepted their explanation that they made a mistake. I think that it's back in. We need to protect the programs around it. It does us no good if we have a seamless system, if we don't have housing, if we don't have advocates that we can pay, so that we have to have the other programs around. And it does us no good if those resources are cut back while at the same time we have the Violence Against Women Act, which funds part of the resources. For the first time, the country is prepared to make a multi-million-dollar, a $1.6 billion commitment. And that means we'll have a chance to put the systems in place. The importance of that just has to be communicated to everyone. There are very careful laws written that don't allow me to say to you, you've got to lobby Congress. I can't say things like that, so.
That's what you need us to do. You need us to talk to our Congress people.
Lawyers follow me around, so I can't say things like that, so. No, she's going to.
I'm B.J. Wood, and I'm the Commissioner of the Mass Commission
Right.
for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. And this afternoon, I heard that there were some advocates that were working in the enhancement of technology in government services. One group of services that must work closely in partnership is the handling of the 911 calls. I'm speaking on behalf of women with disabilities and trying to make that going along with the public education of battered women and particular services that need to be implemented for deaf and hard of hearing. There's oftentimes a frustration that the 911 calls are not accessible. With the new enhanced 911 program, the computers are designed to recognize a TTY call and know how to handle it immediately. So that needs to be implemented, and I would like to see your leadership in that area as well.
I agree, and one of the things about domestic violence that we have to make, we actually talked earlier, that we have to make very clear is not only is the issue bipartisan, but it goes across all classes and in our society, and we have to be as concerned about women with disabilities as we are about upper income women who are also victims of violence, but it takes a particular sensitivity to deal with the issues of disability, and they should not be left out as part of our effort. So I thank you for the point and for being with me earlier today.
Hi there, my name is Stephen Gans. I'm a second-year student at the Kennedy School. Thank you for coming. Mike, you had mentioned earlier that you're trying to look at some of the causes of the violence and trying to address that. And one of the areas of concern is sexual violence depicted by the media in movies, televisions, and music videos, etc. And I was wondering what you see the government's role in intervening with broadcasts of television shows, movies, or music videos that incorporate some of this sexual violence.
Well, we certainly have a role in terms of bully pulpits. I mean, there's no question about it. It's sexual violence and sexual activity in the media has an enormous effect not only on the issue of domestic terrorism, but also on some of the president's concerned about teenage sexual activity and teenage pregnancy. But we also believe in free speech, and we have to be very careful about the government's role in this area. But there's no question about our need to both spend time with the media, and we have, and to speak out. If there's no market, they won't do it. So some of it is the kind of messages we send as a society about what we consider shows that we're going to watch and we want to watch. And I think the media, the major networks and cable have been very helpful to us in a wide variety of areas, including this area, but they have to worry about what kinds of shows they put on at the same time. And I think that the president has spoken out on this, and I think all of us will continue to apply the appropriate bully pulpit pressure without interfering in what we think is simultaneously a fundamental right that we have to be careful about.
Good evening. My name is Chance Briggs. I'm a graduate of the School of Education and Assistant Director of World Teach. You have mentioned a seamless program, and in it what I heard was a big focus on prevention, and once there has been domestic violence or other forms of abuse, to sort of separate the victim from the batterer. It seems to me that a lot of batterers are repeat batterers. If they're not repeat batterers with the first victim, they repeat their battering or other forms of abuse with additional victims. There have been a handful of programs that have sprung up, educational programs to work with batterers. There are several here in the Boston area, such as Emerge. And I'm wondering if support for those programs is part of the package.
Yeah, it is, but we're leaving that to the communities to decide what the mix of support will be. I thought you were going to ask me a little about the education parts of this, because we have spent a lot of time in the department. I mentioned Mary Jo Bain and the Head Start program developing materials for schools so that we're integrating programs to help young people very early on learn that hitting someone is not the way to solve a problem. And I saw one of our model Head Start programs in Chicago, and I was interviewing the 4-year-old, and he said, he absolutely assured me the program worked, and it particularly worked with his mom. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, well, she got really mad at me and she chased me into my room and she was going to hit me. And then I remembered what the teacher told me to say, and I said, what did the teacher tell you to say? And he said, Mom, this is a violence-free zone. You can't touch me. I understand that Sergeant Thomas Tierney is here, and I didn't introduce him. Hi. Thank you. Has the baby been born yet? Does anyone know? Yes.
Good evening. I'm Sally Peabody from Associated Grantmakers of Massachusetts. We're a regional association of private foundations and corporations in the state. I would love to hear your perspective on the most effective ways that private philanthropy can partner with, collaborate with, and at times cajole the public sector, particularly looking in the area of domestic violence.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we're going to have to learn, the debate that's going on in Washington is in part a very useful debate on how public monies are going to be spent. And we increasingly, we started this very quickly on the AIDS programs in the department, believe that the role of the federal government is to set some national standards, but basically leave it to the communities to put together systemic programs, integrated programs, mixing private philanthropy with public monies, so that we have these seamless programs of services that are available, that sometimes have to fit in the Justice Department, and other times are just making sure that during the period of time services are needed, that it's a matter of leadership and filling in the gaps. I don't see private philanthropy as always filling in the gaps. I think often it can play the leadership role and be the glue to fit together the systemic kinds of changes that need to be taken in a whole variety of areas, but particularly for today in the domestic violence area. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Emily Newman. I'm a case manager at Criden Hastings House. I work with young women on welfare, mothers and pregnant teens who are getting their GED. And I'm concerned about the welfare reform, and I was wondering what is being done for women who, with the new welfare reform, that women have to identify the father of the baby. And I was wondering what kind of concerns are going on in Washington for women who are battered and have left the father of the baby or are not in touch with them. What will happen to them?
We have been having a running debate in Washington on paternity establishment. The president's program simply expected the woman to identify the man, and then it was up to the state to follow through. The Republican program actually penalized the woman for the state's failure to follow through, which we obviously think is inappropriate. It seems to me if someone does what they're expected to do and the state bureaucracy breaks down in the process, that the woman and her children ought not to be penalized. Any woman that's in a situation with a batterer in which whatever the paternity establishment process is has to be handled with great sensitivity by the state, by public officials if she's applying for aid as part of this process. But the important point is that we have to hold people responsible for their behavior, whether it's their behavior in relationship to violence or their behavior in relationship to financial support, and that whatever welfare reform proposal emerges, and I would only emphasize that we're still in the first quarter of this. I didn't use sports language until I went to Wisconsin. We're only in the first quarter of this debate. We have a long way to go. It's going to be a long, hot summer, particularly in the debate in the Senate. Whatever it is, it has to have a very strong responsibility piece. People have to be responsible for their physical behavior, for their verbal behavior, and just as important for their financial behavior in relationship to the children that they've brought into this world. And that has to be done with enormous sensitivity. Getting young women as part of their educational experience to understand that, as well as young men, is part of what Al and Linda Wilson, the president of Radcliffe, and I have spent most of our careers trying to do, because part of the education process in any great institution is getting young people to understand what their responsibility is as adults. And I really think it's central to welfare reform, but more importantly, it's got to be central to growing up in America. Let me take one more, and then I'll...
Right, we're dictated by airline schedules here.
I have to...
Hi, my name's...
testifying 3 days in a row.
My name is Melissa Ludke. I'm a fellow at the Public Policy Institute at Radcliffe. And following up on what you said about public monies and the notion of creating seamless webs, I wonder, given the political circumstances now in Washington and the question of attempting to block grant and send money directly to the states, whether you feel that the educative process is far enough along that those states and communities at this point understand how to create that seamless web and the necessity of doing it, or whether there ought to be some standards or principles set by Washington that would indeed target those funds to communities on the basis of setting up a seamless web of services.
The most important line in my speech was that justice shouldn't be dependent on geography in this country. That's as true of domestic violence as it is of welfare reform. As a taxpayer who pays her federal taxes still from Wisconsin, I want to know what Massachusetts is doing with the money that I've sent in. I think the states are different. than they were a generation ago when we used the federal government to stimulate the states to do some things that we didn't want them, that they didn't want to do. We made them behave better than they wanted to behave, using the role of the federal government. This is a debate about federalism that's going on now in Washington. But in the process, we should not refight the Civil War. And in the process, I think it's very important that we understand that simply sending a check to the states will give us what you would expect, and that is an uneven response across the country. Some states will do a very good job with the resources in relationship to domestic terrorism or in relationship to moving people from welfare to work and providing genuine opportunity. And some states will do a lousy job. The role of the federal government is to set some standards and some quality assurance systems in place without interfering with the state's ability to design programs and delivery systems. And we have to find a balance. We micromanage too much now, and we concede that. No one concedes it more than the president, who was the governor.
Right.
But at the same time, we have to have national standards so that the quality of a child's life and so opportunity is not dependent on geography. In the end, the debate in Washington may be about a big issue like federalism, but it's really about what kind of a people we are and what it means to be an American, and whether a kid growing up in one part of the country can go hungry while a kid that grows up in another part of the country doesn't go hungry because the people in that state have put a safety net in place. We put safety nets in place for states for economic reasons to protect them from going deeper into recession, but for people because it was part of our definition of what it meant to be an American, because we cared about what happened to every child in this country, no matter to whom they were born or where they happened to live. And we can't, in the process of getting so tied up with the details of these programs, I think it's important to step back and to step forward and to say there are some things that we believe in as a nation. And one of the things we believe in is that there ought to be safety nets, not to get people off the hook in terms of their responsibilities, but because we think that people make mistakes, that they trip, that they need help during periods of time in their lives, and that's exactly why people fought wars in this country, why we put the country together in the first place, because we wanted to be different than the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
Attention, please. I'd just like to make a quick announcement. As a follow-up to Secretary Shalala's address, the Kennedy School is going to be hosting 2 brown bag events tomorrow and Wednesday entitled Frontline Answers to Domestic Violence, and we'll be highlighting innovative programs dealing with victims and perpetrators, including the Quincy court model that Secretary Shalala discussed. The first one is tomorrow from 12:30 to 2 in the Fainsod room upstairs. And the second is Wednesday from 12 to 1:30. We hope to see you all there.